पिछले महीने अगस्त के आखिरी अय्याम में अमेरिकी फौज ने अफगानिस्तान से इनखला के बाद तालिबान की नई हुकूमत के क़याम के बाद बैनुल-अक़वामी बरादरी अफगानिस्तान में हो रही पेशरफ्त को करीब से देख रही है और हिंदुस्तान भी इसमें शामिल है। इस पस मंज़र में हैदराबाद में कायम एक थिंक टैंक हिंदुस्तान हमारा की तरफ से एक हालिया वर्कशॉप जिसमें माहिरीन, सहाफ़ियों और दानिशवरों ने अफगानिस्तान के ताज़ा तरीन बहरान पर एक दिलचस्प बहस छेड़ी है कि भारत को अपने मफादात के तहफ़्फ़ुज़ के लिए क्या किरदार अदा करना चाहिए। इस खुसूस में आज हम वज़ारत ख़ारजा के साबिक़ सेक्रेटरी और काबुल में हिंदुस्तान के साबिक़ सफ़ीर रह चुके विवेक काटजू के बयान को पेश कर रहे हैं जो उन्होंने इस वर्कशॉप से मुखातिब किया है।
No.
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, thank you. And thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor and pleasure to be on this panel with people who are knowledgeable about Afghanistan. We've heard the chairman give a very detailed and analytical account of Afghanistan and the current situation, the issues that are before the country, and also before the international community. The chairman has instructed that we don't have to go into history, so I will observe that, except to say that these last 20 years will become a subject of great research by social scientists, historians, military experts. Principally, I think on three axes. The first, of course, will be with regard to terrorism. How has the entire global war on terrorism proceeded? If after 20 years, the group that was ousted from Afghanistan for supporting the Al-Qaeda is back in power. As far as the designation of Taliban as terrorists is concerned, I'm not quite sure if under the 1267 UN committee, they are formally designated as terrorists or not. Certainly, many individuals belonging to the Taliban are designated as terrorists because of their association with Al-Qaeda. That is how the committee proceeds. So, in that sense, they are under sanctions still. And I suppose there will be a meeting of the 1267 committee shortly. And this is an issue of which that committee and the powers concerned will have to address. And if, unless I'm mistaken, I think India chairs the 1267 committee, at least for the time being. So one of the studies will be on this global war of terrorism. The other would be on nation building, the entire exercise, how nations evolve. And the third, of course, will be on the formation of armies, because the Americans were surprised. President Biden himself has said how this army collapsed, the army that they had built. And I think many experts here too, who were looking at the Afghan scene, were surprised at the speed and the rapidity with which the Afghan national security forces just gave up. And that was, I think, on account of not following the traditions of war fighting in Afghanistan, apart from the ethos of the army that the Americans were helping to build. Now, as far as the immediate is concerned, the point, the chairman himself mentioned this, which is relevant, is that unlike the 1990s, when no country except for three, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, no one else in the international community recognized the Taliban, and the UN seat was still held by the government of President Burhanuddin Rabbani, and Ahmad Shah Massoud's resistance in Panjshir and in some of the areas in the north, in Kunduz and in Takhar had continued. This time around, I think there is no international consensus on the on the Taliban, on the government that will be formed. It was quite clear from the last Security Council meeting, which adopted on the 30th of August, which was again presided by us because we held the rotating presidency, that there was a grave difference of opinion on issues concerning the Taliban between the Americans and their allies on one side, and in fact, the rest of the international community on one side, and China and Russia on the other. It had not, the consensus that was not there. The Chinese and the Russians allowed that resolution to go through because they abstained, and that was indicative that that resolution contained elements with which the Chinese and the Russians had no quarrel. But at the same time, there were other elements about which they have great concerns. And the statements made by the Chinese and the Russian representatives to the Security Council were very significant in this respect. Now, at the moment, the government is expected to be formed. Some kind of an Iranian model is being considered, and I can mention that on the Track 2 circuit, many years ago, a Pakistani senior diplomat who has had extensive dealings with Afghanistan said that perhaps the future lies in forming some kind of Iranian system in Afghanistan, and it's curious now that they're going back to that system. The talk is that Hebatullah, who will be the supreme leader, and he will be in Kandahar in the tradition of Mullah Umar. But Hebatullah's hold on the Taliban will certainly not be anywhere close to that of the founder of Mullah Umar. It remains to be seen if he will don the cloak of the Holy Prophet, which is in Kandahar, like Umar did, and formally declare himself as the Amirul Mu'mineen. So that remains to be seen. Certainly, in government formation, there are tensions, and that's quite obvious because the Taliban are largely ideologically and theologically similar. They follow the same kind of tradition. I don't think that there are cracks in their theological and ideological orientation. But on the tribal axis, there are major differences, and we all know, anyone who's familiar with Afghanistan knows that among the Durranis and the Ghiljais, and of course, there are differences, leave alone with the Zadrans. The Haqqanis, if I'm not mistaken, are Zadrans, and the Zadrans were never really taken very seriously in Afghan society. They provided some muscle, but now the situation is different. They are asserting themselves because they have provided the foot soldiers, and the Zadrans are the Haqqanis. So I think at the moment, it will be interesting to see how they mesh this in, leave alone how they take into their governance structures representatives of the non-Pashtuns, because the Taliban is a Pashtun force. So certainly in terms of inclusivity, which everyone is saying, except the Chinese and the Russians, they haven't really talked of inclusive governments. They will be, I think, people in the West and elsewhere will be disappointed because they will not get in people from the who were holding office and senior office in the Afghan Republic. Maybe in some consultative capacities, technocrats they may get in, but certainly not the politicians. I don't expect that. Now, as far as their governance is concerned, there will be some focus. And here I find there is a commonality between the Chinese, Russians, and the rest. And that is on 2 points. One is on terrorism. Uh, no one wants Afghanistan to become a center for terrorist groups. And here too, there are differences. And the Chinese and the Russians seem to be focused more narrowly on groups of their concern. Many in the international community are focused more generally. Certainly, the Americans seem to be focused on groups which can harm them, and they think there are a large number of groups that can harm them. So this aspect will be very closely watched. And the second is on what is broadly termed as human rights. And here, I think there will be no consensus in the international community. There will be differences of opinion on how the Taliban are approaching gender issues, their criminal justice system. Though here too, I think no one will accept, including the Chinese and the Russians, will find it very difficult to accept if the Taliban revert to their practices and policies of the 1990s on the treatment of women, on the administration of criminal justice. As far as the political system is concerned, the system which they will pursue will be quite different from that of the Afghan Republic. I don't think that they contemplate elections. I don't think they will give permission for political parties. So we'll really have, and in this respect, they will may be very different from the Iranians who, as you know, allow elections, and they allow the election to the president. So, so here it will be interesting to see how they evolve. The other issue on which there will maybe consensus is on narcotics. This is an element which I think is often overlooked by scholars and by the political, by the diplomatic class and security analysts as they look at Afghanistan, because in many ways Afghanistan is a narco state. In the 1990s, 1/3 of the Afghan economy was maintained through the flows of monies that used to come from the production of illicit opium. Now that narcotics as a proportion of Afghan GDP has become far less, but narcotics contaminates all aspects of Afghan national life and public life, and that is something which I think in course of time will become more and more of an issue. If the Taliban have been gaining during these last 20 years, they've gained money from narcotics, and if financial flows don't come to them, then I think they may be inclined to continue with that source of quote unquote revenue. Now, if the Taliban pursue policies which are unacceptable to the West, then I think the weapon employed against them by the West will be that of freezing of assets. That's something which the West has already done. They will maintain sanctions against specific individuals in the Taliban system, and they will delay any kind of diplomatic recognition to the Taliban. So that is how I see the present situation and the situation with regard to Afghanistan unfolding over the next 12 months, as far as the Panjshir defiance, what I term as the Panjshir defiance is concerned, uh, the Taliban would like to end that defiance so that it doesn't convert into an insurgency. They know full well that they were able to accomplish whatever they did because they succeeded with Pakistani help to maintain an insurgency and to keep it going, and gradually. And this is something where I think many observers are not looking at things closely. Yes, there have been very major changes in Afghanistan, in Afghan society, uh, in the last 20 years. But here there is a sharp divide between the cities and the rural areas. Why is it that the Taliban were able to persuade not only Pashtuns in the rural heartlands of the south, the southeast, and the east, but also large sections, and it's quite apparent the way they just went uh, over the last 2 months, the way they just expanded, shows quite clearly that they'd built up constituencies in the Tajik, among the Tajik, the Uzbek, and on the Hazara, I'm not so sure what is the situation, but certainly among the Tajik and the Uzbek, otherwise they wouldn't have just gone through Badakhshan the way they did, and also in Kunduz and Takhar and Baglan. And so the question mark in my mind is the Hazara areas, because there is a problem and contradiction between the Shia and the Taliban, who are Deobandis at the end of the day, with elements of Wahhabism coming in, but their hardcore beliefs are those that originated in the seminary in Deoband, and they then have been transmuted through the madrasas of Pakistan and Afghanistan. And in addition, there's been the infusion of some elements of the Salafist ideologies from the Arabian Peninsula. So, on the Shia question, I have still no certainty. But on the others, clearly they've built up constituencies. Now, just a couple of words about the challenges for India. I have long maintained, as the chairman said, that we should have engaged the Taliban, and I've been saying this over many years, and I'm therefore glad that the government now is openly engaged the Taliban. And I was also struck by what I've heard the Foreign Secretary said in Washington recently, that the Taliban seem to be more reasonable. Now, we'll really have to wait and watch things on the ground, but that shows that there is a certain flexibility developing in the Indian approach towards the Taliban, and that is good, because the real challenge that we face is not only from Pakistan and the kind of use they can make of the Taliban and a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, but to my mind, more so because of China. And herein, I think in course of time, the Chinese have made it quite plain that they want to do business with the Taliban Afghanistan, and the Taliban have also reciprocated by saying the Chinese will be the principal economic partner. That shows that a congruity of interests is growing, which can be extremely dangerous for us, because the Chinese already have Pakistan in their pocket. They are making very rapid ingress into Iran, And while there is some contestation from Russia and even, I dare say, the United States and the Central Asian states, but the Chinese have a dominant influence there, and they are rapidly developing their connectivity. And the only missing link here was Afghanistan, where we had a certain space to pursue our interests. And if that space also goes the Chinese way, as the Chinese will certainly try to ensure, then things will really mean that that we can lose our entire entire Western neighborhood, and that's something which we can't allow. Therefore, I'll conclude by saying that conclude by making 2 points. This engagement that we've begun with the Taliban must continue very rapidly and must deepen. The way it will, the precise manner in which it will be, the engagement will continue, is of course for the government to decide. They will know when to send a group to Afghanistan, to Kabul. I, for one, believe that we should ask the Taliban that we would like to, in principle, that we would like to see that not only our mission in Kabul functions, but that our consulates are reopened at a time of our choosing. That will indicate their approach to us, because the Pakistanis have spread an enormous amount of propaganda about our consulates, and some very exaggerated figures have been given. We can expect that Pakistani pressure will be there on the Taliban to prevent the consulates to reopen. So therefore, this will be an indication of how far the Taliban wishing to go and with us, and whether they can afford to be somewhat independent of Pakistan when it comes to issues which are critical to us. And the last point I'll make is that at this time, the government must allow those Afghans who have had close connections with India and who want to come to India to do so. They should not grow a feeling. I think all of us who've served in Afghanistan, and there are many colleagues I've spoken to, know that for Afghans, India is a very special place, irrespective of their ideological orientations, and that India has stood by Afghans. So now a feeling should not grow that at a time when they were in trouble, that India turned its back on them. Hence, I think this is a point that should be noted and implemented. Otherwise, we may suffer not only reputational damage, but there may be a loss of confidence in us as in the future. So this is something which I do feel is important, and it will not be contradictory to developing relations with the country. Thank you, Mr. Chair.